For decades, the United States government ran a secret domestic operation with one goal: to neutralize what it saw as internal threats. But these so-called threats weren't spies or terrorists. They were civil rights leaders, organizers, community builders, black men and women demanding dignity, equality, and justice. The program was called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, it officially launched in 1956, targeting communists. But by the mid-1960s, COINTELPRO turned its full attention toward the Black liberation movement. The FBI did more than keep people under watch. They planted informants, spread lies, used intimidation, and were involved in actions that sometimes ended in violence. Yes, this actually happened. It was carried out, recorded, and had real consequences. The stories we'll cover in this video are not just about the FBI. They're about the black leaders whose lives were disrupted and in some cases destroyed. Leaders who dared to challenge a country still gripped by white supremacy. Give this video a like to show your support. And let's begin with one of its earliest and most watched figures. A man whose belief in nonviolence made him a target anyway. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arguably the most famous civil rights leader of the 20th century, and, as it turned out, one of COINTELPRO's prime targets. By the late 1950s, Dr. King had risen to national prominence, advocating nonviolent resistance to end segregation. He led the 1955 to 1956 Montgomery bus boycott, and in 1957 co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to coordinate civil rights campaigns across the South. King's philosophy of nonviolence and his appeals to American ideals made him a widely respected figure, culminating in the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. But King's popularity and influence also alarmed J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. In the Bureau's eyes, the civil rights movement threatened the status quo, and they were eager to find grounds to undermine its leader. As early as the founding of the SCLC in 1957, the FBI began monitoring King and his associates, initially justifying the surveillance by alleging communist influence in the movement. One internal memo in October 1956 folded the FBI's ongoing surveillance of black leaders into the COINTELPRO program on the premise that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists. Key King associates like advisor Stanley Levison and organizer Bayard Rustin were flagged, and through them King himself came under FBI scrutiny. Hoover's personal distrust of King soon grew into open animus. In August 1963, the March on Washington drew 250,000 supporters, and King's oratory captivated the nation, an event that Hoover saw as a tipping point. After that march, Hoover singled out King as a major target for COINTELPRO, instructing his deputies to intensify operations against the civil rights leader. FBI Assistant Director William C. Sullivan, who led the COINTELPRO section, wrote a notorious memo following King's speech. In the light of King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security, Sullivan warned. By Hoover's order, the Bureau was effectively treating Dr. King as an enemy of the state. The FBI's campaign against King was sweeping and relentless. Under Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy's hesitant approval, the FBI installed wiretaps on King's phones starting in October 1963, ostensibly for a one-month trial, but in practice it became a years-long invasive surveillance. Soon the FBI was systematically bugging King's home and his hotel rooms, monitoring his private conversations around the clock. Teams of agents shadowed King during travel. They tapped the SCLC's office phones and those of King's colleagues. Importantly, this surveillance produced no evidence that King was involved in any unlawful or subversive activity. FBI reports acknowledged that King was not a communist himself. Nevertheless, Hoover was determined to neutralize King by any means necessary. The Bureau shifted to a strategy of personal sabotage. They hoped to destroy King's reputation and influence by exposing details of his private life. By mid-1964, FBI wiretaps had picked up evidence of King's extramarital relationships. Instead of ignoring these irrelevant personal matters, the Bureau saw an opportunity. In November 1964, just as King was to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the FBI took the extraordinary step of sending an anonymous package to King in an attempt to blackmail him. Inside the package was an audio reel of the FBI's secret recordings, purporting to capture sexual encounters, along with an unsigned letter drafted to sound like an angry civil rights supporter. This missive has since become infamous as the FBI-King suicide letter. The letter explicitly attacked King, calling him a complete fraud and a liability, and asserting that black people would no longer tolerate such filthy, abnormal behavior. It concluded with a menacing ultimatum. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. The clear implication was that King should take his own life to avoid public exposure of the tapes. The timing was calculated. The package was sent days after the announcement of King's Nobel Peace Prize, presumably to reach him before the awards ceremony. King indeed interpreted the letter as an effort to drive him to do it. But King did not bow to this vile intimidation. He told associates, "A letter of this sort will not deter me." And he proceeded to accept the Nobel Prize in December 1964. Stymied by King's refusal to back down, the FBI escalated its dirty tricks. When King would not acquiesce, FBI Assistant Director Cartha D. DeLoach initiated a media leak campaign, offering the salacious surveillance transcripts to friendly journalists in early 1965. The FBI tried to plant stories accusing King of immoral conduct, hoping to splinter his support among faith leaders and donors. Around this same time, King had publicly criticized the FBI for its failure to protect black citizens from racial violence in the South, noting that the Bureau seemed ineffective against Ku Klux Klan terrorism. Hoover's response was to publicly call King the most notorious liar in the country in November 1964. This was an extraordinary public smear from the nation's top law enforcement official. Behind the scenes, Hoover continued to press his agents to find any avenue to disgrace King. Internal FBI communications candidly discussed using news outlets, ministers, sponsors of the NAACP, and others hostile to King to circulate derogatory information from the wiretaps. In essence, the FBI acted as a propaganda machine against King, supplying ammunition to his segregationist opponents to undermine his moral authority. Despite these efforts, King's stature only grew as he led the historic Selma voting rights campaign in 1965 and spoke out against the Vietnam War by 1967. But the FBI never relented. Even after King's assassination on April 4, 1968, the Bureau continued trying to tarnish his legacy. A year after King's death, the FBI was still, in its own words, attempting to furnish ammunition to opponents of King to enable attacks on his memory and to block efforts to honor the slain leader. Hoover personally intervened behind the scenes to try to derail plans for a national holiday in King's honor, providing derogatory FBI files to Congress and state officials in 1969. The depth of the FBI's hostility was such that even death did not exempt Dr. King from COINTELPRO's grasp. Only in the 1970s, when COINTELPRO was exposed, did the truth of this campaign come to light. The 1975-76 Church Committee investigation confirmed that the FBI's intent was not law enforcement at all, but to thwart King's leadership of the civil rights movement. One Church Committee report noted that the FBI had hoped to remove King from his pedestal and replace him with what Hoover deemed older, more established, conservative black leaders like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. In essence, the FBI wanted to choose Black America's leaders by eliminating those like King, whom Hoover saw as too progressive or too independent. The consequences of COINTELPRO's crusade against Martin Luther King Jr. were profound. In King's lifetime, the FBI's hounding undoubtedly caused him great stress and worry. Friends observed that he was keenly aware of being surveilled, and the anonymous threats weighed on him. The attempted blackmail in 1964 was described by historians as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of FBI. King persevered, but the FBI's constant pressure may have narrowed the space for him to build broader alliances. After King's assassination, the FBI's failure to protect civil rights workers came under scrutiny. Although a lone gunman named James Earl Ray was convicted of King's murder, The climate of hatred and suspicion that COINTELPRO helped foster cannot be disentangled from the violence of the era. By dehumanizing black leaders as national security threats, COINTELPRO contributed to an atmosphere that made political violence appear permissible to extremists. King's tragic death was not directly at the FBI's hands, but the Bureau's obsessive targeting of him remains a stain on American law enforcement. It wasn't until years later that King's image would be rehabilitated in the eyes of the federal government, and by then, Hoover was gone and COINTELPRO disbanded. In 1977-78, a federal court ordered the FBI to restrict its domestic surveillance practices, directly citing the FBI's record with Dr. King as an example of abuses to be prevented. Today, Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated as a national hero, and even the FBI publicly claims to honor his legacy. A bitter irony, given that in King's lifetime the Bureau saw him as an enemy to be destroyed. While King drew crowds with hope, another voice challenged the country with sharp clarity and anger. This other man did not ask for change, he confronted it. And for that, the FBI saw him as a different kind of threat. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, and later known as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, was one of the most influential black nationalist leaders of the 1960s. His journey from a street criminal to a minister in the Nation of Islam, and then an independent revolutionary figure, made him both admired and feared. With his fiery rhetoric and uncompromising stance on black self-defense, Malcolm X represented a more militant voice than Martin Luther King Jr.'s integrationist approach. He spoke to the anger of northern urban black communities and challenged white America's conscience in blunt terms. By the early 1960s, as Malcolm X rose to prominence as the national spokesperson for the NOI, the FBI had taken notice. Hoover's FBI opened a file on Malcolm as early as the 1950s, and by 1960 they had designated him a security risk, in part due to the Nation of Islam's radical rhetoric. Malcolm's espousal of black separatism and his indictment of American racism made him a natural target for COINTELPRO once the program expanded to focus on black extremists. Hoover's COINTELPRO mandates specifically mentioned the need to watch for a charismatic leader who could unify black militant factions. Malcolm X, with his international following, certainly fit that description. Even though Malcolm's philosophy differed greatly from King's, the FBI viewed both through the same lens of suspicion. An FBI counterintelligence report explicitly noted that the Bureau should try to widen the rift between Malcolm X and his mentor, NOI leader Elijah Muhammad, employing infiltration and the sparking of acrimonious debates within the organization. In other words, the FBI sought to exacerbate the internal tensions that eventually led to Malcolm's break from the Nation of Islam in March 1964. FBI files declassified years later show that the Bureau had multiple informants close to Malcolm X. During the early 1960s, while Malcolm was a minister in Elijah Muhammad's Chicago-based Nation of Islam, the FBI managed to embed informants at various levels of the NOI hierarchy. These informants fed Hoover's agents information about growing discord between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, stemming from Malcolm's increasing popularity and Elijah's jealousy, as well as Malcolm's learning of Elijah's moral indiscretions. Rather than simply observe, COINTELPRO took active steps to aggravate this discord. The FBI's New York office, for example, reportedly crafted fake communications and anonymous letters designed to fuel paranoia within the NOI's ranks. According to a 1976 Senate investigation, FBI operatives spread rumors to ensure Malcolm X's suspension from the NOI and to fan the rivalry between Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad. One documented COINTELPRO tactic was to send an anonymous letter to Elijah Muhammad, insinuating that Malcolm X was planning to supplant him, and simultaneously to suggest to Malcolm that the NOI leadership was plotting against him. Such divide-and-conquer schemes were a COINTELPRO hallmark, and in Malcolm's case, they capitalized on existing fissures. In March 1964, Malcolm X did indeed leave the Nation of Islam after a bitter fallout with Elijah Muhammad. While the primary reasons for the split were internal, FBI files indicate the Bureau was pleased at this outcome and continued to monitor both factions closely. After leaving the NOI, Malcolm X founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity and began moderating some of his earlier rhetoric. He embarked on travels across Africa and the Middle East, embracing a more global Pan-African perspective and even softening his stance on interracial cooperation after his pilgrimage to Mecca. However, Malcolm's break with the Nation of Islam put his life in grave danger. He was now seen as a traitor by the NOI's most zealous members. The FBI was well aware of the death threats against Malcolm. In fact, one of Malcolm X's top security men, Gene Roberts, turned out to be an undercover officer from the New York Police Department's intelligence unit, which often coordinated with the FBI. Despite inside knowledge of plots against Malcolm, no one intervened to protect him. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in front of a ballroom crowd in New York by gunmen identified as members of the Nation of Islam. The FBI has always denied direct involvement in Malcolm X's killing. However, it is documented that the FBI's campaign of infiltration and rumor-mongering ultimately led to Malcolm's assassination. FBI records show that in the months leading up to the murder, Bureau informants and agents worked to intensify the feud between Malcolm and the NOI. Following Malcolm X's assassination, the FBI's involvement came under scrutiny. 3 men were convicted of the murder: Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam from a Nation of Islam mosque in Newark, New Jersey, and Thomas Hagen from Harlem. It later emerged that the FBI and NYPD had withheld exculpatory evidence during that trial. For instance, undercover operatives knew Aziz and Islam were likely not involved, but this was not revealed. Decades later, in 2021, Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam were formally exonerated after a reinvestigation found that authorities had wrongfully convicted them and suppressed key information. That reinvestigation by the Manhattan District Attorney implicated both the FBI and New York police in failing to prevent the assassination and in perpetrating a miscarriage of justice. Furthermore, in 2023, Malcolm X's family filed a lawsuit alleging government agencies, including the FBI and CIA, conspired and executed plans to assassinate Malcolm X, or at least willfully did nothing to stop it. While these claims remain the subject of litigation and historical debate, what is clear is that the full extent of the FBI's involvement in Malcolm X's death is unresolved. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Manning Marable concluded that most of the men who plotted Malcolm's assassination were never apprehended, and that the full extent of the FBI's involvement cannot be known. In other words, there were likely additional conspirators or informants with roles that were covered up, and FBI files on the case remain partly secret or destroyed. In 2010, on the 45th anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, the Washington Post reported that some former agents themselves believed the Bureau had complicity in Malcolm's death by knowingly fanning the flames that led to it. Indeed, a retired agent admitted that COINTELPRO initiatives did everything short of pulling the trigger. They wanted Malcolm neutralized, and neutralized he was. The tragedy is that rather than engage with Malcolm X's critiques of racism, the US government, through the FBI, sought to silence him. COINTELPRO succeeded in contributing to Malcolm X's demise, yet his ideas survived. Malcolm's life was cut short, but his indictment of America's racial crimes and his call for black dignity remain deeply resonant. Even after all these decades, the FBI has yet to fully acknowledge its complicity. The death of Malcolm left a vacuum that younger voices tried to fill. One of them was Stokeley Carmichael. He was bold, impatient, and determined to take the fight in a new direction. It didn't take long for the Bureau to move in. In June 1966, activist Stokeley Carmichael stood on a Mississippi roadway during the Meredith March Against Fear and proclaimed Black Power to a crowd of marchers. This moment marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. The slogan Black Power captured a new spirit of assertiveness and racial pride among Black Americans, especially the youth. Stokeley Carmichael, then only 25 years old, instantly became the face of the emerging Black Power movement. As the newly elected chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Carmichael had already been a veteran of the freedom rides and voting rights campaigns in the Deep South. But unlike mentors such as Martin Luther King Jr., Carmichael grew impatient with nonviolence and interracial coalition building. He argued that Black Americans needed to build independent political and economic power, free from white influence, even if it meant embracing radical and militant strategies. His bold ideas and fiery oratory made him a celebrity of the late 1960s Black liberation struggle. They also made him a prime target of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Hoover regarded Stokeley Carmichael as one of the most dangerous black leaders of the era. Internal FBI documents show that by 1967, the Bureau saw Carmichael as a radical who had the potential to unify various black militant groups. A March 4, 1968 FBI memo, the same memo outlining goals to prevent a black messiah, explicitly singled out Carmichael. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way, it noted, discussing the prospect of a leader who could unify the movement. Hoover was alarmed that Carmichael was forging links between SNCC and the Black Panther Party, which was founded in Oakland in 1966. In early 1968, Carmichael accepted the title of Honorary Prime Minister of the Panthers and floated the idea of merging SNCC with the Panthers. To the FBI, this was a nightmare scenario, a broad coalition of black student activists and urban militants under charismatic leadership. Hoover swiftly ordered COINTELPRO measures to stop it. Declassified COINTELPRO files reveal that the FBI launched a multi-pronged plan to undermine the SNCC Panther alliance and to bad-jacket Stokeley Carmichael as a CIA agent. Bad-jacketing was a tactic where the FBI spread false rumors that a movement leader was actually an informant or traitor, thereby isolating them. In Carmichael's case, FBI operatives set out to convince his colleagues that he was secretly working for the Central Intelligence Agency. The FBI's campaign against Carmichael was extraordinarily malicious and effective. In August 1967, as urban riots flared across cities, COINTELPRO's Black Nationalist Division authorized field offices to use imaginative schemes to sow discord among black activists. One such scheme, as recorded in FBI memos, was to send anonymous letters accusing Carmichael of being on the CIA's payroll. The Bureau actually forged letters and distributed bogus gossip to make it appear that Carmichael was betraying the movement. At the same time, the FBI targeted Carmichael's personal relationships. Carmichael had married the famous South African singer Miriam Makeba in 1968. According to histories of COINTELPRO, the FBI harassed Makeba by pressuring immigration authorities, effectively contributing to the couple's decision to leave the United States. In April 1969, under growing pressure, Stokeley Carmichael and Makeba relocated to Guinea, West Africa. But even exile did not fully shield Carmichael. FBI files show that the Bureau kept tabs on him overseas and shared information with friendly foreign intelligence services to limit his activities. One of COINTELPRO's most infamous moves came in late 1968. Hoover's agents sought to fracture the already tenuous relationship between Carmichael and the Black Panthers. The Panthers' leaders, Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, were known to be wary of outside influence. The FBI exploited this by circulating a false rumor within Panther circles that Carmichael was working for the CIA to undermine the party. They even forged a letter, purportedly from a Black Panther to a Panther leadership, accusing Carmichael of disloyalty. The result was swift. By 1969, the Black Panther Party publicly denounced Stokeley Carmichael. Cleaver and other Panther spokesmen began calling Carmichael a traitor, and Panther newspapers insinuated he was an agent provocateur. Feeling betrayed and unsafe, Carmichael disassociated from the Panthers. This COINTELPRO fabricated slander not only ruined Carmichael's relationship with the Panthers, but put his life at risk. It is well known that suspected informants in those circles could be subject to violent retribution. Indeed, Carmichael's split from the Panthers was so acrimonious that some of his former comrades reportedly talked of targeting him, and he fled the country largely for his own safety. By the end of 1969, Stokeley Carmichael was effectively neutralized as a domestic political force, just as COINTELPRO intended. He spent the next decades of his life in Guinea under the name Kwame Toure, continuing to advocate Pan-Africanism and socialism from abroad, but with far less influence on U.S. affairs. In retrospect, the consequences of COINTELPRO's actions against Carmichael were significant for the Black Power movement. SNCC, the organization he once led, had already been under tremendous strain. After Carmichael's departure, SNCC collapsed as a national organization by the early 1970s. The Black Panther Party, for its part, became distrustful and internally divided. Partially due to FBI spread paranoia about infiltrators, the Carmichael incident being a prime example of how that paranoia was stoked. The FBI considered Carmichael's exit a victory, but there was also an ironic long-term consequence. Carmichael became a living witness to FBI repression. In interviews from Guinea, he would often explain how the US government had chased him out for daring to demand true freedom. His experience helped shape the Pan-African perspective that American white supremacy was upheld by government espionage and coercion. Carmichael lived out his days contributing to African liberation movements and returned occasionally to the US as an honored revolutionary elder. But the domestic movement he had led in the 60s was shattered. In 1998, Carmichael died of cancer at age 57. In one of his last interviews, he suggested that his cancer might itself have been inflicted by the US government, a claim impossible to verify, but reflecting the deep distrust born of his COINTELPRO experiences. Whether or not such theories hold weight, the fact remains that COINTELPRO robbed Black America of one of its brightest young leaders at a critical moment. The phrase Black Power still echoes in history, but the FBI's campaign ensured that its chief spokesman was silenced before he could fully realize its vision. If Stokeley Carmichael pushed the movement forward with his ideas, Fred Hampton did it on the ground. He organized, fed communities, and started building coalitions the government didn't see coming. Until it did. At just 21 years old, Fred Hampton was a charismatic leader who many believed could be the next great Black political figure. As chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in 1969, Hampton had accomplished astonishing feats of community organizing. He was a brilliant orator and coalition builder, known for uniting activists across racial lines in Chicago. Hampton famously helped forge a multi-ethnic alliance, dubbed the Rainbow Coalition, bringing together Black Panthers, the Latino Young Lords, and even poor white Appalachian youths to address common issues of poverty and police brutality. He organized free breakfast programs for children and health clinics in Chicago's West Side, winning broad support in Black neighborhoods. Importantly, Hampton's message went beyond Black liberation. He preached working-class solidarity and revolutionary change of the whole system. This made him a uniquely dangerous foe in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, a leader who could potentially unite disparate groups into a powerful movement. As Hampton's profile rose in 1969, FBI officials started to view him as the very embodiment of the feared Black Messiah that COINTELPRO was tasked to prevent. Hoover had already declared that the Black Panther Party, founded in 1966, was the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. By 1968, COINTELPRO was heavily focused on disrupting the Panthers nationwide. In Chicago, where Fred Hampton led the Panthers, the FBI worked hand in glove with local law enforcement to undermine the party. The key infiltrator in this effort was a man named William O'Neill, a 20-year-old who had been caught for car theft and agreed to become an FBI informant in exchange for leniency. O'Neill joined the Chicago Panthers and quickly rose to become Hampton's bodyguard and the chapter's chief of security, all the while secretly reporting to the FBI. Through O'Neill, the FBI kept meticulous tabs on Hampton's activities, from his daily schedule to the layout of Panther apartments. By late 1969, as racial tensions and violent confrontations between Panthers and police escalated across the country, the FBI in Chicago intensified its surveillance of Hampton. The special agent in charge of COINTELPRO in Chicago was Roy Mitchell, who was O'Neill's FBI handler. In the early hours of December 4, 1969, COINTELPRO's covert war turned deadly in Chicago. Acting on information provided by informant O'Neill, the Cook County State's Attorney's Police Unit, with coordination from the FBI, launched a pre-dawn raid on Fred Hampton's apartment. The raid was carried out purportedly to search for illegal weapons, but it was effectively an assassination mission. The officers arrived armed with a detailed floor plan of the apartment, a map supplied by O'Neill to the FBI, and then passed to the police. That map clearly marked where Fred Hampton would be sleeping. At around 4:30 a.m., while Hampton and several fellow Panthers were asleep, reportedly after being drugged by O'Neill to keep him from waking, police burst through the door and opened fire. They fired nearly 100 rounds into the small apartment, bullets ripping through walls and windows. In the initial barrage, Panther member Mark Clark, who was on security duty by the door, was killed instantly. apparently managing to get off a single reflexive shot from his shotgun as he fell. Officers then stormed into Hampton's bedroom. Hampton's pregnant fiancée, Deborah Johnson, was in bed with him. She recalls being pulled from the room as Fred lay unconscious from the sedative. The police fired point blank into Hampton's body, killing him in his bed. Another Panther was also shot dead, and several others were critically wounded in the onslaught. The Chicago police and FBI initially portrayed the raid as a justifiable shootout, claiming the Panthers had opened fire on the officers. However, physical evidence later completely disproved that narrative. Ballistics experts and a federal grand jury found that almost all bullets, over 90 shots, were fired by the police into the apartment. Only one shot came from the Panthers' side. The crime scene indicated that Fred Hampton never even left his bed or fired a weapon. In essence, it was an execution. Witnesses reported that an officer shot Hampton a second time at close range after he was already gravely wounded, allegedly saying, "He's good and dead now." Notably, the FBI's fingerprints were all over this raid. In 1971, the public first learned of COINTELPRO's existence, and by the early 1970s, the Hampton case became a focal point of accusation that the FBI had conspired to murder a black leader. Investigators discovered an internal FBI document from December 1969, in which Hoover's office congratulated the Chicago office on the Hampton raid. In one memo, the FBI authorized payment of a $300 bonus to informant William O'Neill for his information leading to the raid. Another FBI letter, uncovered years later, showed Hoover personally commended Agent Roy Mitchell 6 days after the raid, praising his efforts in a matter of considerable interest to the FBI in the racial field, and approving a monetary reward for Mitchell. These documents leave little doubt that the FBI viewed the operation's outcome, Fred Hampton's death, as a success for COINTELPRO. Further evidence of the FBI's role came from courageous whistleblowers. In 1977, retired FBI agent M. Wesley Swearingen provided testimony in the Hampton civil case, admitting that the FBI had foreknowledge of and involvement in the raid. Swearingen stated that the Bureau deliberately set up the Chicago police to confront the Panthers by inflating fears that the Panthers would resist violently. Essentially, FBI intel was used to ensure the police approached the raid expecting a fierce gun battle, which likely prompted the police to shoot first and ask questions later. In court proceedings, a Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals opinion in the late 1970s pointed to evidence of a conspiracy between law enforcement to subvert and eliminate the Black Panther Party and its members. The murder of Fred Hampton, that court suggested, was a result of this concerted effort by the FBI and local authorities to neutralize the Panthers by any means necessary. After over a decade of litigation, a process marked by stonewalling and cover-ups, a measure of justice was finally achieved, at least symbolically. In 1982, the federal government, state of Illinois, and Cook County agreed to a civil lawsuit settlement with the survivors of the raid and relatives of Hampton and Clark. They paid $1.85 million to end the case. Importantly, while the defendants did not officially admit wrongdoing as part of the settlement, the payout spoke volumes. One of the plaintiff's attorneys, Flint Taylor, declared, "The settlement is an admission of the conspiracy that existed between the FBI and State Attorney Hanrahan's men to murder Fred Hampton. Indeed, by that point, the evidence of collaboration, from the floor plan to the informant's bonus, was so damning that public opinion had largely accepted that Hampton was the victim of a government assassination. For Black America, Hampton's assassination was a searing lesson in the lengths to which the state would go to suppress Black liberation movements." The 21-year-old activist had been on the verge of implementing a broad, inclusive vision of change, combining socialism, anti-racism, and cross-racial solidarity. His potential seemed limitless. Some thought he could eventually run for mayor of Chicago or higher office. All of that ended in a storm of bullets. The long-term impact is reflected in art and memory. Hampton's story has been retold in generations of scholarship, songs, and most recently, in the acclaimed film Judas and the Black Messiah. As tragic as Hampton's death was, it ultimately contributed to the collapse of COINTELPRO when the truth came out. Yet for the movement he represented, the damage was done. A generation of Black revolutionaries was left without one of its brightest lights. Fred Hampton's favorite slogan was, "I am a revolutionary." The FBI and Chicago authorities answered that revolutionary cry with gunfire, showing just how afraid they were of what Hampton stood for. COINTELPRO didn't only go after men. Angela Davis was a professor, a communist, and a black woman who spoke her mind. That was enough. She would become one of the most hunted people in America. By the late 1960s, Angela Y. Davis had emerged as one of the most prominent black women activists of her time, an outspoken communist, a brilliant scholar, and a fierce critic of racism and the prison system. Angela Davis first gained national attention in 1969, when then California Governor Ronald Reagan led the charge to have her fired from her position as a philosophy professor at UCLA due to her membership in the Communist Party. This episode put Davis squarely in the crosshairs of law enforcement. J. Edgar Hoover took a personal interest in Davis. As a black Marxist and vocal ally of the Black Panther Party, she embodied multiple threats that Hoover's FBI was fixated on: black empowerment and left-wing radicalism. It is little surprise then that Angela Davis became a target of COINTELPRO in the late 1960s. FBI field offices opened extensive files on her activities, monitoring her speeches and travels. When Hoover initiated the COINTELPRO operations against black nationalist hate groups and the New Left, Davis fit the profile of someone to watch, a black intellectual forging links between civil rights, black power, and socialist movements. The moment that truly thrust Angela Davis into the national spotlight and into a direct collision with the FBI was an event on August 7, 1970, at the Marin County Courthouse in California. On that day, Jonathan Jackson, a 17-year-old, took over a courtroom at gunpoint in a bid to free his brother George Jackson, who was one of the Soledad brothers, 3 incarcerated black revolutionaries. The incident turned into a shootout that left a judge and others dead. The guns used in that attempt were later traced to Angela Davis. She had purchased them legally, allegedly to protect the Soledad brothers and herself. Although Davis was not present at the courthouse, the state accused her of complicity, alleging she conspired in the attempt to free the prisoners. Faced with serious charges including conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder, Angela Davis went underground. Just days after the Marine incident, Hoover himself added Angela Davis to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, one of the few women ever to earn that dubious distinction. The manhunt for Angela Davis in the late summer and fall of 1970 was one of the FBI's most high-profile operations. Hoover's FBI devoted tremendous resources to capturing her. Agents followed up sightings across the country. Angela Davis, aware of the danger, moved clandestinely between safe houses, at times disguising her appearance. Meanwhile, the FBI was coordinating with police departments nationwide. On October 13, 1970, after roughly 2 months on the run, Angela Davis was arrested by the FBI at a motel in New York City. She was found unarmed and taken into custody without resistance. Upon her arrest, FBI Director Hoover reportedly was overjoyed, and President Richard Nixon personally congratulated the Bureau on the capture of the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis. Nixon's statement, referring to Davis as a dangerous terrorist, encapsulated the official line on Angela Davis at the time. To many observers, it was shocking rhetoric to use against a philosophy professor and activist, but it reflected how deeply the government had villainized her. In fact, Nixon's branding of Davis hinted at why the FBI and political leaders like Reagan and Nixon were so intent on neutralizing her. She represented a bridge between militant black activism and broader leftist, even global revolutionary currents. That posed an ideological threat they were keen to destroy. Angela Davis's arrest catapulted her into the global spotlight as a symbol of political resistance. A Free Angela Davis movement sprang up almost immediately, with rallies, buttons, and posters demanding her release. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries made Davis a symbol of American political repression, while in the US, many activists saw her case as the epitome of racist and political persecution. Importantly, Davis was not accused of pulling any trigger. She was essentially charged for her associations and beliefs. This made her a political prisoner in the eyes of her supporters. The FBI and prosecution, on the other hand, sought to paint her as a mastermind of violence. During her 16-month incarceration awaiting trial, Davis was subject to heavy security and isolation, underscoring how much of a high-profile prisoner she was. All the while, COINTELPRO did not explicitly end until 1971, so it's likely that the FBI continued to gather intelligence on Davis's supporters and any mobilization around her, feeding information to state authorities. The trial of Angela Davis took place in 1972 in Santa Clara County. It was one of the most prominent trials of the era. Davis and her legal team argued that she was being framed for her revolutionary beliefs, a political frame-up, as she declared in court. The prosecution had to prove that Davis was involved in planning the courthouse attack, which was a tall order. After weeks of testimony, including Angela Davis's own passionate defense, the jury delivered its verdict in June 1972. Not guilty on all counts. Angela Davis was acquitted, affirming her insistence that she had no role in the violent events. It was a stunning defeat for the state and by extension for the FBI, which had expended enormous effort to put her behind bars. The outcome was celebrated worldwide. John Lennon and Yoko Ono wrote a song for her titled Angela. The Rolling Stones referenced her in Sweet Black Angel, and millions who had followed the case rejoiced at the news of her freedom. After her release, Davis continued her activism, focusing on prison reform and speaking against the very systems that tried to silence her. The FBI's pursuit of Angela Davis backfired, elevating her to an even more prominent status. Yet the intensity of the campaign against her had lasting effects. Angela Davis herself has reflected that it was a trial of the movement, as much as a trial of her, meaning the state was aiming to repress revolutionary movements by crushing one of their prominent figures. The psychological toll on Davis and those close to her was immense. She lived with the knowledge that her own government hunted her like a terrorist. That kind of experience leaves scars. Davis herself noted that losing your job, being labeled a terrorist, facing prison, all of that was intended to send a message. The FBI's message was that black women too, who dared to challenge American racism and capitalism, would be dealt with severely. Today, Angela Davis is a respected author and professor, her image no longer that of a fugitive but of a seasoned elder of social justice movements. But the history of how her government treated her in her 20s serves as a dark reminder of COINTELPRO's reach. It reached into universities and lecture halls, not just street corners, in its quest to neutralize black dissent. COINTELPRO confirmed that the U.S. government saw black liberation as a threat. But the people they tried to silence, Angela Davis, the Panthers, Dr. King, left behind something far more powerful than fear. A legacy of courage, vision, and unshakable resistance. The program is now remembered as a betrayal of civil rights, but also as a wake-up call. It showed us that the fight for justice doesn't end. It must be carried forward, generation after generation. What inspires you most about the leaders who stood tall against COINTELPRO? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if their legacy moves you, hit like, subscribe, and keep this spirit alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.